Hi. Thank you. Hi, my name is Fiona, and I'd like to make you all very warmly welcome this evening. So my name is Fiona, I'm an avid reader, and I'm so pleased that we're all here to attend what I know will be a wonderful event as we celebrate the publication of Women of Brisbane by Judy Watson. A special thank you to those who are joining us by Zoom. Say hello to everybody on Zoom. Hello. Great. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land where we gather, the Yagara and Turrbal, and pay all of our respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is an area where people have farmed, fished, cultivated and gathered stories to share for generations after generations. And we at Avid hope to play a small role in continuing this very long tradition. And because we have people joining us from all around Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners throughout Australia as well. So some quick housekeeping. Now's the chance to turn your phones to silent, but do feel free to engage in as much social media as you like. And if you're tweeting, we are Avid Reader 4101. You need to add the 4101, otherwise you at this wonderful bookshop in the US. We're desperate to go and meet each other. We're always getting messages and emails. And so tonight I'm delighted that we're celebrating publication of Women of Brisbane by Judy Watson with a panel discussion hosted by Cheryl Leavy. After our discussion, we'll have time for questions, and also if you're in Zoom land, you can text a chat box thing, the questions through, and they'll be relayed to me, and I will be able to convey them. And then we will be selling copies of the book at the counter. We have various editions of the book. We have Women in Brisbane for $33. We have Women in Brisbane with the artist poster for $88. And we have Women in Brisbane with a very limited print edition for $185. And we also have The Preponderance of Aboriginal Blood, also by Judy Watson, and that's a limited edition of $49.50 as well. So if you're in Zoom land and you would like anything signed, just give the shop a ring and we can make that happen. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome the fabulous Cheryl Levy, who is the Executive Director of the Partnerships Branch of the Queensland Department of Environment and Science, and pages. So Cheryl has also worked in the private sector and state and federal governments in diverse fields, including health, taxation, education and transport. In her previous role as Deputy Commissioner at the Queensland Family Child Commission, Cheryl supported QFCC's drive to oversight, improvement and reform of Queensland's child protection and family support system. She's also enjoyed a long career in arts administration, serving on several boards, including Queensland Art Gallery, Canberra Museum and Gallery, ACT Cultural Council, the Queensland Music Festival, and she's currently on the Brisbane Writers Festival and the Institute of Modern Art. More importantly, she lives in West End, and her daughter works with us next door.
Turrbal, Willing, Yambaraban Yagra, Ugrable, Turrbal, now Wu, Yulu Wadiwando, Yambaraban Yagra, Ugrable, Turrbal, now Wu, Australia, Yilu Yambaraban Mudun, Wadiwando, Yambaraban, Nathumadan, now Wu, which means hello to everybody, hello to my people. I'd like to acknowledge especially all of the First Nations people that are joining us tonight, here and online. This is Yagara, Yugurapul and Turrbal country. It always was and always will be their country. This country, Australia, the song country, always was and always will be the country of my people. This is true and this is good. Nachu Wurabanya Winja, Nafu Kuma, Guamu, Ngatu Yambaraban Dadanga Kalamalanya St Georgeka, which means that my name is Willinger and my country is between Cunnamulla and St George in southern inland Queensland. While I sign back in, because of course it turned off. I'd like to introduce the panel members while I swing my feet because I can't hold them on the chair. Philippa Mcdermott. Philippa is a committed public advocate and champion for diversifying the media, content and workforces to best reflect contemporary Australia. With over 25 years' experience in media, arts and employment, Philippa provides strategic thought leadership and direction on implementing corporate strategies, including RAPs, employment and economic development and diversity strategies. Her role at the ABC is Head of Indigenous Employment, which is about getting as many Indigenous people as possible on air and into the ABC and the media more widely so that we can tell our stories from our perspective. Philippa's goal is for an Australia that acknowledges and embraces our shared history and culture to build authentic, purposeful relationships with First Nations peoples. Philippa is the chairperson of Bandarra Dance Theatre and a board director of the Australian Indigenous Leadership Centre. That's a very short list because I wrote my own bio for Philippa just in case, and there's many more achievements than that. Though I did give them a little bit of a tip. You can't tell us everything that you've done and that you're great at because we'll be here all night. This is a very impressive group of women that we're meeting with tonight. Let's move on to Hilary Langford. Hilary was brought into Indigenous circles in the late 1950s when her mother Muriel Langford started engaging with people like Auntie Rita Huggins. Muriel Langford was shocked that Indigenous people were invisible unless, of course, they were doing something seen as negative. Anything Muriel took on resulted in her total family's involvement. This led to Hilary spending weekends playing basketball, which she wasn't at all good at, with Opal younger set members, attending Opal dances on Saturday nights. I've been to a few of those. Being a leader at the annual Opal camps for Black and White Settlement and City Kids, making her debut at Cherbourg in the 1960s, studying anthropology at uni and eventually gaining a degree in social work. And in between all that, Hilary fell in love with quite a few young and charming Indigenous men. It actually says this here in that bio, which I didn't write. Hilary, I'm not telling anymore. That's not the whole story, but anyway, that's another panel. Hilary didn't fully understand how amazing Muriel was in what she did until more recent decades. Muriel, which was also my grandmother's name, was a white woman ahead of her times and a catalyst like so many other women described in the Women of Brisbane book. She's proud to tell just a small part of Muriel's story tonight. Lynne Morrow was born and raised here in the Meanjin area of Scottish and Irish ancestry. Her parents brought her and her brothers up with an appreciation of the land and all the natural environment and a sense of fairness in dealing with people. Late in 1964, with Mrs. Joyce Wilding, she was involved with Opal House in Russell Street. So many intersections already. I think almost all of us on the panel might have a bit of an Opal story to tell, maybe a few in the audience as well. Her most recent work was with the Stolen Generations campaign. Stolen Wages campaign. It says that here, I just said Stolen Generations. An issue which she first encountered way back in 1966. Chelsea, did I do you yet? No, I haven't done you yet, have I? Chelsea Watergo is a Mununjali and South Sea Islander woman born and raised in the outer suburbs of Brisbane, Reed-and-Ala, on Yadra country. Another intersection, my grandmother was at 85 Azalea Street. Where are you guys? Abelia. Abelia. All named after, all named after flowers. She is a mum of 5. I know. And also an associate professor at the University of Queensland. I'm not sure how those two things go together. She's really, really smart. Yeah. And is one half of the Wild Black Women Wild Black Woman on 98.9 FM. And in the audience, we have Auntie Dr. Auntie Jackie Huggins and Professor. And many of the descendants of women who feature in the book are in the audience tonight. Welcome to you all and welcome everybody. I told you we could nearly take up the whole event with the intros. Those were the short bios. Imagine if we did the long ones. Each of these women have contributed to bandarra-gan chidna. Is that correct, Judy? Is that close? Which means...
Kate Saunders here too?
Aaron's here.
Aaron's here?
Yeah,
Cool.
Aaron's here.
Great. Yeah. Just want to acknowledge Kate Saunders.
We'll acknowledge Kate, who is feeling unwell, and I'm not sure that she's here. Are you here, Kate?
No,
Yes.
Aaron.
She's
Her daughter is
Yeah.
Hi, Erin. Thank you for joining us. I didn't ask permission, so I won't do that, but my thoughts are with you, Erin. I know a little bit about what's going on. Each of these women have contributed to bandarra-gan chidna, Strong Woman Track, or Track of Strong Women. What a great name. Let's start with one of Alice Ether's poems that features in the book. I'd like to bring Alice into the room. I know her family is also, has given me permission to do this, and is also perhaps in need a little bit of spirit from us tonight. We've got to keep this fire burning with ash on our feet and coal in our hands. Teach bararrojiba, all of them young ones, how to live side by side. Because tomorrow, when the sun rises and our fires have gone quiet, they will be the ones to reignite it. It's such an ambitious project, this book, reigniting the legacy of women, many of whom their stories have never really been fully told or were deliberately silenced. Chelsea. A lot of the women in this book were rendered into genteel, leisure-based pursuits, the type of thing that women of their times were expected or allowed to do, or for First Nations women rendered almost completely invisible. How important is it to recast the stories of Brisbane women?
Gee, that's a tough question. For me, as a Brisbane Black woman on the outer suburbs, what I get from this, because the stories of Black women aren't invisible to me, so they may be invisible to an audience somewhere, but not to me. And I think one of the things that I struggle with in the reclaiming story is often it's a story of adversity, and that story of adversity is this marveling at the adversity that Black women have overcome, which is so powerful and important. But sometimes what gets lost in the story is the theorising and strategizing of Black women in the course of all of that. So people marvel at well, how do you do that? But don't actually go, well, what do they know? And understand Black women as knowledge keepers. And I just think recently I had to grapple with some stuff, and I always go to Black women's writing to make sense of what I've got to deal with at any given time. And so it's Auntie Jackie in the audience. I was angry about something and overwhelmed by something, and I went back to firing my mind with Sister Girl, and was reminded about what drives the Black writer. And so what makes me uneasy sometimes when we tell the stories of Black women is we forget the knowledge that Black women possess. And so it's so important to that we capture the knowledge and not just go, oh wow, you can do that and do that, or you came through that. It's the knowledge that has guided our women through that. And I get strength not just from the story, but from the knowledge that's contained by the women who those stories are about. And I think that's a really important part of that conversation, because that's what's rendered invisible. Black women aren't cited in that way, and that's when we become invisible, like our knowledge isn't cited. And so I think it's important that we become visible by trauma, we become visible by overcoming adversity, but we never are visible as knowledge keepers. And I think as a Black woman and as an academic, my work is driven by the knowledge keepers of Black women in this place that have come before me, and I'm very grateful for that knowledge.
And that's not, yeah, that was a great answer. And that's not just something that's occurred in the past, it's something that's happening right now. So it's not just an experience of women in this book that was silenced way back then. It's something that even you yourself have experienced as an academic now in a contemporary setting.
Yes.
Yes. Illuminate us.
I mean, the thing is, it's a good reality check, because it's like, you know, you can have stuff happen. You're like, this is just because it happened to me now, it's not like the first time it's ever happened. And that's why we return to story. That's why we return to that knowledge, to go, Black women have navigated all this stuff before. And that's the place we learn. And it's important for me because I was raised by a white woman. And I love my mother, but she knows that her experience is incommensurable with mine. And I've been very fortunate that she's recognized that. So I've had to turn to various Black women in my life, in my world, by text, by relationships and community, to understand what it means to be a Black woman in this place and to survive as a Black woman. Because when I try and behave like the indignant white woman my mother is, that gets me in a whole lot of trouble. And I forget that the rules don't work the same way. So I had to turn to the knowledge and the experience of Black women who've gone before me to understand that my body's read differently. And the bruises that are inflicted upon it, the healing comes from the work of Black women. That knowledge about what to do with those bruises, how to theorise your way out of them, how to reconcile wins even though it feels like a loss. So I just love that there's this catalogue of these amazing women, just to remind us of whatever we're facing now is nothing, and the knowledge that we need to get through the stuff now is there. It's not invisible, it's not absent, it's there.
In reimagining, I've got one more question for you before you hand the mic over, maybe one. In reimagining all of these stories into a wider collective history, are you comfortable with that? Are you comfortable with all of these stories sitting together? Are we suggesting that there's some kind of sameness, that there's some kind of collectivity that denies somehow maybe the intersectionality of race and gender that you've just spoken about?
I mean, I think that stands for the stories of each of the women featured, and you can read that in terms of how the stories start and the arc of each person's story. So I think they stand in their own right, and I think that's the power of the methodology of people contributing those stories. So they stand. It's not like someone else just took them and narrated them and smoothed them all together as though they. And you read it as you read it. The stories read in a different style and technique, and which makes it beautiful. It's just because it reflects this space that we're at. And so I think one of the stories is an email exchange between Joe Dreesen and an uncle, you know. Yeah. I just love how these stories came to life in their own way, properly. And they didn't need to all align with the same kind of structure and format as though our lives are structured in the same kind of way, because we know they're not. So I think there's a beauty in that. And of course, this idea that Indigenous women somehow, I mean, we've heard in the bios that the idea that in Brisbane, Indigenous women sat here and non-Indigenous women sat there, that just isn't the story. I just think about, as we're yarning before this. And so this reflects where we're at. And there are a whole range of different stories about what it means to be a woman of Brisbane. I just love the fact that there was a foregrounding of Indigenous women in Brisbane, because there's just such power in those stories.
Thank you, Chelsea. Philippa, part of your career focus, as we heard in your bio, has been fairness in representation in the media. Do these themes or values of yours that are really clearly represented in your career and the consistency of it show up in the lives of the women that you most admire?
Okay, that's complicated, but thank you. Yeah, she's tough. So, look, firstly, I just want to acknowledge country. Want to acknowledge that I'm on Turrbal, Yagara and Yugara land. I'm not from here. I live on Gadigal country and Bidjigal country in Sydney at Kamay, Botany Bay. but my people are Mullinjali and Waka Waka, my beautiful grandmother who's in the book, Philippa Mcdermott. And I was just talking to Jackie Huggins, who's we used to call her the Queen of Inala. My grandmother, not Jackie. Maybe Jackie's the Queen now that Nan's passed, but so yes, thank you for having me. Thanks for for allowing me to talk about my grandmother's legacy. I was saying to the ladies and the sisters that I would swim the Pacific to keep my grandmother's legacy alive, absolutely, and to tell her story. Now I'm going to cry. But also it's Reconciliation Week. So happy Reconciliation Week, everybody. Yeah, absolutely, yay. And, this is a nice gathering because it is Reconciliation Week. And I think, not to be trite, but I think the book kind of tells that story without telling that story. Everybody, every single person in this room and in this world has a different story. And I think that's beautiful that the book is not a flowing, easy kind of narrative that blends everybody together. I love the book because you could pick it up at any page and read something completely different about people that you've never heard of, and just hear a snapshot of this story. It's almost like a digital kind of montage, I suppose. Well, not digital, but it's a hard copy montage of what is going on in the digital world now. Do you know what? And I love that because they're just these snapshots, and it's a snapshot into someone's world and someone you'd never thought about, you'd never think about. And plus the book is so beautiful, I have to say, Judy, and the others, honestly, it's just, I had it on the plane with me last night, and I had a glass of wine. I thought, I have to put the book down because, knowing me, it's so beautiful. I'm going to spill the wine, on the book, and people actually sitting next to me are asking, what's that book? That's amazing. Look at those pictures, So thank you. I'm sure I haven't answered your question. That's how journalists get out of answering the question.
I'm going to ask you a different question. Something that I've mused on for quite some time, and I'm sure all of the First Nations people in the room will be like, yeah, what is it with blackfellas and grandmothers? We are obsessed.
Oh, well, like Chelsea, my mother was Dutch. And so I didn't have a black mother. My father is Aboriginal, and of course, so grandma. So I was lucky to have that, knowledge. And I think even without her purposefully giving me knowledge, it's just kind of sunk up by osmosis, and the way she does things and the way she is and who she is, and and so I had that. And of course my father, or any man's story, is a completely different story, and I can't even imagine a woman being born in 1917 on Waka Waka country. Her country was taken over by pastoralists, of which is now Eidsvold and Hawkeswood Station. They stayed on there for 3 generations. So my great-grandfather ended up being the head stockman. All the family, worked, on the station and what have you. And imagine being a woman born in 1917. You move to Inala. Well, so after being on the station, working on the station with 13 brothers and sisters, extended family, get off the station because you weren't allowed to go to school, right? You had to get, it was up to the white families and the principal of the school if you could go to school, and then you had to have a doctor's certificate to say you were free of disease to go to school, and that was primary school, not even a hope in hell of going to high school there. So having to leave there to get, to get a better life. She met my grandfather in Southport. She had a job, in Southport. They met his mum and Charlie. And then moving here to Inala in the 40s. And she said they used to ride a horse and buggy here into Brisbane. Along that road, it used to take 3 hours or more to get from Inala to here. So, you know, it's just, yeah, exactly. I mean, even when I've come here all my life, so I almost feel like I live here, like I've come here 3 or 4 times a year for my whole life, every year, see the family, whatever. And I do remember it was like such a long trek, you know, to get out. And now it's like 20 minutes, maybe. So still haven't answered your question.
You might have answered the better question. We were talking about a couple of things, whether or not your values are essentially connected to the values of people that you admire. Have the values that you've got now really been impressed into you by women in your life? Have they formed you?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, my mother, who's non-Indigenous, of course, my grandmother, all the women around me, I am so lucky to have great friends, and some of who are Anita Heiss in the audience, and a couple of Jackie, and, you know, my beautiful cousin here, Waka Waka cousin, Katina Olsen, you know, women everywhere. And, you know, I love the sisterhood. I just love the sisterhood, you know, and they say there's 2 kinds of women, you know, girls, and then, you know, girls that aren't, or women that aren't. I seem to only know and attract those kind of women that, you know, are really for the sisterhood. And I think I've just learnt by osmosis and hanging out with great people, being fortunate, so fortunate to hang out, read great stories of women, have been exposed. Like I'm old-ish, you know. Well, no, look, I worked in Aboriginal affairs in the 80s and the 90s, you know, in New South Wales, worked in land rights, you know, great women, you know, doing all of that kind of stuff. Then worked at ATSIC, so as a media manager at ATSIC, so working with great women there and great men, of course, you know. And so through all of those things, you just tend to meet amazing people, and so you learn a bit from everybody. You take the good and the bad, you know, and then you take the good and throw away the bad. And, you know, so it does kind of give you those lessons, I think.
What's the essence of your grandmother's story that you would like everyone to know? If you can answer that question without crying. Sorry.
The essence of my grandmother's story. Well, there's a lot. I think she became a leader in her own community without actually seeking any leadership. It was not conferred upon her by any, you know, non kind of, you know, in any kind of Western way. I mean, obviously, being one of the eldest of 13 brothers and sisters, and kinship relationships, exactly, I have that. But she, I think, became a leader through survival, through a need to survive, through a way to survive. She was faith-based, you know, and she knew, because of her lack of education, although she was super smart and whatever, that education was the key to our, you know, to our success. So she did everything she possibly could to get everybody in our family and anyone she knew into education. So her and my mother always said, Philippa, they can try and take our land away, they can try and take our culture away, they can try and take our language away, but no one can ever take your education away. And so that's why my father ended up with a scholarship to Churchie, you know, and then cousins after that. And she had tried through the Anglican Church, who also supported her, you know, to get our kids into education. And if I think if she, you know, I mean, there's a million things I could say about her legacy and her spirit and the things that she wanted, but that, I think, was the most important thing to her, because she could see where that would take us.
I don't want to claim this for the old girls of Inala, but it does seem like a really common theme, because that sounds like the story of my grandmother, Yanni Jackie. Same approach, and your family as well, same approach, that education was the ticket to freedom. Education was the way that you would essentially have agency over your own life and your own future. Yeah. Okay. Hillary. In then Auntie Jackie, and we'll learn as we go along the connection between many of the people on the panel and Auntie Jackie's family, which is why she was such a pivotal contributor to the book. But in Auntie Jackie's introduction to the book, she writes of women who break the marble ceiling, women who break the mould. Your mother broke the mould for the women of her times. Let's start with, though, what brought your family to Brisbane.
If my mother was still alive, she would be 107 this year. So, and she was born in England, so in 1913. So just picture back then, pre-suffragettes, all of that sort of stuff. She went to Sunday school when she was about 4 or 5, and a little boy passed her a note. And she couldn't read at that stage, so she had to get her older sisters to read the story, what it was. And it said, when I grow up, I'm going to marry you and I'm going to carry you on my back to India. And he didn't marry her, but she did go to India. In fact, she married my father before the Second World War, and they were conscientious objectors, which meant he automatically lost his job because you weren't allowed to work in England if you were a conscientious objector.
For the young people in the room.
For the young people in the room, it means then he said he would not become a soldier and fight. They actually had German friends, and her first child she called Gretel, which was a German name, and her German friends had their first child that they call Margaret, which was an English name from the same Latin derivative, to say that they were bonded in friendship, despite the fact that they were at war together. So at the end of the Second World War, my mother had got a job as a housekeeper to put food in the bellies of her 2 children at that stage and a roof over their head. And she heard on the radio that they were looking for somebody to go and manage a hospital in India. And she advised my very conservative father, we're going to India. And again, no social media, no, they knew nothing. They'd never been further north from Manchester. And they went out to India on the first passenger ship, which was accompanied with a whole military convoy because the German submarines were still active. They went to India, and Mum quickly discovered that the colonial UK people were utterly boring, and as were the US commercial people, were totally and utterly boring. But she fell in love with the culture and the graciousness and the innate intelligence of Indian people, and became totally absorbed in that culture. In fact, 11 years later, we immigrated to Australia, but she couldn't bear to leave the culture. And she had me taught, I was only 5 or 6 at the time, but I was taught Bharatanatyam, which is a classical Indian dancing, because she felt she couldn't bear to leave India and that culture. But she was assured that there would be Indigenous people with a rich culture when she came to Australia.
However, she arrived in Tasmania and she was told a completely different story, one that was untrue.
We arrived in Tasmania in 1956, and we were quickly told that there aren't any Indigenous people left in Tasmania. They were all rounded up and killed, and the last woman died, and I forget which year it was. And my mother was heartbroken because she still looked around at all of these white faces and found them pretty boring. And of course, that was probably in some ways unfair because people were living the life as they could. But when she met them at the ferry to go from East Devonport over to Devonport, they were all dressed in pearls and long gloves and hats. And she looked at them and thought, they look like they're going to an English garden party. But she said, when they open their mouths, they don't really have anything much to say. compared with the richness that she'd found in India. So they were only there for 20 months and then moved to Brisbane.
And when they came to Brisbane, your mother really started to stir the pot.
Oh, she sure did, because now she knew she was on the same piece of dirt as people who were Indigenous. And one of the very first people she met was Joyce Wilding, who you had contact with. In those days, Joyce Wilding was a white woman who lived in Melbourne Street. And somehow she had started opening house to Aboriginal people who perhaps had escaped from the settlements, because in those days you had to have permission to leave places like Cherbourg and Woorabinda and Palm Island. You had to have permission to marry the person you loved from, you know, the person who was in charge of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And she found that Joyce Wilding and her husband, who was quite not a very wealthy builder, were feeding any Aboriginal people who turned up. And she thought, okay, this is a great start. Mind you, this was much to the abhorrence of my father, who wanted a wife who stayed at home, who wore pearls and a hat and gloves. And so we lived in a very turbulent family, because this was not a happy family. She broke the mold. She also, and remember this is 1958, 59, 60. She used to also ride a bicycle to my primary school without a bra.
Sounds like a West Ender.
Without shaving under her arms, wearing
Definitely.
sandals. And she taught religious instruction, much to my total and utter embarrassment. So I went to religious instruction with the Anglicans. She gathered up almost every other child because she was such a wonderful storyteller. And she broke the mold, I mean, all the time. And it's taken me longer, I think, to break the mold.
Lynne, there are so many intersections with the women who have already spoken on the panel tonight. Would you like to share a little bit of those? Would you like to help us make all of those connections? Because there are so many intersections, Opal and Joyce and many others.
Yes, well, I suppose I was just lucky. I ran into Joyce Wilding and children in Musgrave Park at the end of 64.
Sorry.
Is that better?
Yes, right.
Okay.
Thank you.
I was just lucky. I ran into them, and Miss Wilding invited us back to Russell Street, and it really changed my life. I started to learn about this country from a different point of view. And I was only young, I was 22, I think. And so, of course, being a white fella, I had all the ideas on what people should do to fix things up. But I was lucky, I was so young that nobody really told me off. They said, yes, there. And so I stayed for quite a while, and I met people there who changed my life, like Auntie Janie Arnold was one of my great mentors. Yes, through the rest of my life, or the rest of her life anyway. And the stolen wages was an issue that I met there. One of the things I had to do, Mrs. Wilding asked me to take this person into town. There's an old couple. They got all dressed up in their best clothes. They'd come down to town to visit their grandchildren, and they wanted to buy some presents for their grandchildren. So let's go into town and get some money from their account. I didn't know. I thought I was taking them to a bank. Took them into town. We went upstairs, and DNA or DAI or whatever it was then. And some young clerk said to them, "What do you want the money for?" nobody ever asked me that. And they said they wanted to buy presents for their grandchildren in town, and they never got any money. They got a coupon to take to McDonald and East down the road. This was an experience that made me realise what a difference my life I had in growing up. And from then on, I suppose, I mean, straight away after that, I started asking questions, and after a while I realised I didn't know how to fix anything, so I went overseas.
Was this before or after you had some involvement with the Brisbane Council of Elders?
Oh, the Brisbane Council of Elders, they didn't start until 88, and it was your grandmother. I was sitting in the park in 1988 at the protest march in 88 there, and I remember her saying, we have to have a group of old people getting together regularly to talk about things and sort this community out. And that's what started the Council of Elders, 88.
Let's now throw to some questions from the audience, because I'm conscious we may well run out of time at 7:20. We've got about 10 minutes left. Perfect timing for questions. Are there any questions from the audience?
Is it questions from the audience or questions from Zoom, Melissa?
Yeah. Oh, I'll give you just so for Zoom. That's what I was missing out.
Okay, we can
Just to everyone on the panel, really, was there anything in the book that totally surprised you?
Yeah.
Oh, so sorry. The question from Melissa Lukashenko was there anything to the panel? Was there anything in the book that really surprised you?
Yes. I thought I could only have a paragraph. And Judy Watson. And so that's the thing that surprised me when I saw all these others. I thought I could have gone on and on about my nan, and I just gave the most brief, kind of overview of like some of her Anala and stuff. And I thought, oh, look at that. Oh my goodness. So yeah, that surprised me.
So can I ask a question of the panelists?
Just use your phone.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question to the panelists. If the person you wrote about could respond now, what's one thing you'd love to tell them? Like with my mum, she's now passed away, so there's something I'd love to tell her, but I'm sure there's some things what would you love to tell your grandmother now that she missed out since she passed?
Oh, look, I don't think, I personally, I think I've been fortunate enough to spend so much time with my beautiful Nana that I've told her everything, and we've said everything to each other that we've ever needed to say. But I think what she would like to see is her great-granddaughter, my daughter, succeeding and being happy and healthy and proud. And all, I think it's just more about the kids, and that things have changed. I just cannot even, she of course told me stories from growing up in the First World War to now. She died in 2016 and she was 98, and she was good to go until she was about 96. So she was fully involved and out there and doing everything. So that's nearly 100 years, right, of being absolutely involved in and present and great mind still going. It was really only her body that kind of gave way, not even her mind. She always just cared about the children, like making sure that it was going to be better. And after it, just my life experience, over 30 years of working and being, part of, whatever you want to call it, I suppose, Aboriginal affairs, for lack of a better word, I think there is a change, and I think things are moving. It's slow for us, but compared to where we've been and how long it's taken us to get to where we are now, I can see so much change, you know, just in my lifetime. So I think that's what she, you know, she'd just be happy to see. And so many people identifying, you know, like there's been more, you know, people are proud now. We were, you know, scared to, even when I was growing up, we used to say sometimes we were Spanish or whatever, because like otherwise the racism was crazy. So even just that in the last 10, 20 years has really changed things. So thanks for the question. What about you, Sissy?
Okay, so disclaimer, I didn't write a contribution for the book. I just got roped in the other week. But shout out to the Wadigo women and the Williams women in the book who I'm related to. I think the gift really is the book then to my children. I think people underestimate what it is to, or take for granted that you can encounter texts about you. As Aboriginal people, as Aboriginal women, it's still a novelty to see ourselves reflected in the stories told about us, let alone be directly related to people who that story is about and be narrated as heroes in the text, not subjects, not victims, but heroes, right? Warriors. And so that's still a new experience for me and for my children and many people here. And so this text really is not something I speak back, but what I hand on then to my children to know who they are, where they come from, and not just in terms of come from and country and connection, but the stories that they come from, those stories of strength and survival and that it comes from a place. So there's something really powerful in the gift that then gets handed on to those that come next. And it's so we're very grateful to have that gift.
Hillary, what would you say to your mother?
Auntie Jackie asked Hillary, what would she say to her mother?
I'd like to pick up on the education thing. When Mum died and we had a memorial celebration of her life, and we decided to do an open mic and just pass the mic around. And after 2.5 hours, we had to stop it because the afternoon tea was going cold. And basically the number of people, and it was probably predominantly Indigenous people, who stood up and just talked about education and talked about how she harangued them and pushed them and shoved them and just wouldn't let them give up, because I think education, and she would have loved to have heard that. And, you know, to have beautiful Nairi here, whose son is the first Queensland Supreme Court judge. What a change from Auntie Rita Huggins, who was the stolen generation, to her daughter, to her grandson, who's the first Queensland Supreme Court judge. I mean, what a huge, huge leap that is. You can't achieve that, I don't think, in any other way than education. But the other thing, a more personal thing that I wish my mother knew, and of course she believed in God and heaven, so I've got to keep that frame of mind. So from her point of view, she's up there smiling, because my youngest son is married to a woman whose grandmother is a full-blood Aboriginal from Alice Springs. Yeah, we're all full of blood, but she's totally, utterly Indigenous, which is, again, it's wonderful to me, and she would be so thrilled. When she arrived in Australia looking for Indigenous people, she would never have known that full cycle, which is so beautiful. And this little boy, Lucas, which we love so much, I just think she's up there cheering and saying, isn't this wonderful, that she's helped create the community that you were talking about, that is an improved community, a more accepting community, a proud community. You don't have to pretend you're Spanish anymore. And I even brought a picture of his other grandma and my little grandson, who she would be so proud and so loving if she was alive still.
I was just thinking, Auntie Jackie was talking to me from the crowd about my grandmother's funeral and how there was a mic and people were invited to come up and speak. And those church pews got real hard after a few hours. And if I reflect on what I would say to my grandmother, I would have to say I don't have anything to say to her that I'm not saying to her already. I speak to her almost every single day, and she speaks back to me. And I know that every single thing that happens in my life is by her hand. And you might think of that as being metaphoric, an influence that she's had. But my belief is that it's literal. I don't know how some of the things I have experienced and achieved happened other than the fact that she wanted them to, and she made it happen. We are just about out of time, and I can hear alarms going off. So I will wrap up. It's 7:30. In the words of Kay and Jackie.
I'm sorry, I think a question just come through.
Oh, okay, if we've got extra time.
Absolutely.
Oh, except I can't quite read that.
You also broke the screen. That's really hard to read.
Okay, now you're making me look old. I have to look over my glasses. So one of them says, no question, but I'm so thankful for tonight's panel. It has blown me away. Just thank you, thank you, thank you, and I love you all. Another says, I am in awe, exclamation mark. And I do tend to want to ask about the possibility of an audiobook in the future, but I realise that it's a repetitive question, and a lot of these texts take a while to come out as audiobooks, if at all. Maybe we do an audiobook, Judy, and perhaps the people who made the contributions could do the readings. A bad idea if we have the time to do it. Another question?
Well, it's more a thank you to Judy as a male who's read the book. I just think it's an amazing thing for my sons and men in Brisbane to read such an amazing collection of women's stories, and how inspiring it is, and how I think it really does elevate women to the place where they should be. Like the strength in that book of women in Brisbane really shines through. It's an amazing inspiration.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to the people online who didn't get to hear that, and it would be impossible to summarise, but thank you. Any last questions before I wrap up?
Volume 2.
On the walk down here, Judy did say we wouldn't be getting a reprint, but that's not the same as saying there won't be a volume 2.
Somebody else.
Somebody else can do it, she says. Is that you, Anita?
I'm up from New South Wales.
Okay. So in the words of Kay and Jackie, this book looks forward by looking back, beckoning a dawn of a more equitable storytelling, a more equitable shared legacy. Or as Ujuru might have put it, a new day calling. And in the words of Maureen Watson, it has rewritten the story of power and glory. And finally, in the words of the forever young Alice Ether, these flames, us, will be their guidance. Ngā and thank you all.
Oh, thank you all so much for coming. It's been a truly wonderful, moving night. Thank you for joining us on Zoom throughout Australia. Once again, copies are for sale at the counter, but can I ask you to join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Cheryl Levy, Chelsea Bond, Philippa Mcdermott, Lynne Morrow, and Hilary Langford. Thank you. And a special thank you to Judy Watson. And there's some other thank yous as well. Kay Saunders, Gudger Kerry Charlton, Louise Martin Chu, Ray Kirkhoff, Philippa Mcdermott, Cheryl Leavy, Katina Davidson, and Hilary Langford, and Jackie Huggins. Thank you. And the Museum of Brisbane, especially. Oh, I'm going to put my glasses on.
Yeah, okay, so Renee Grace and Rachel Estrin, UAP, Milani Gallery, and also books, Matthew Wingett, and all of the authors, because they're not all here, so all of the authors whose descendants are these women. I am not an author, you know, and Louise Martin Chu and I, that's why we only had a paragraph. Editors, you know, and it's sort of like what is possible, but, you know, a wonderful book designer too, Michael Phillips, etc. But to all of you, it's not my book, it's your book, so thank you.
So